probably need to update that photo. It's 4 or 5 years old. Definitely don't look like that, as you can see. Yeah, second day, first thing in the morning. Thank you all for being here. Really ecstatic. Yeah, great vibes. Yeah, today I'm gonna talk about governators, and you're probably wondering, what the hell is a governator, and why do we need it? Yeah, I will dive right in. Just as a background, my name is Josh Lee. I'm a co-founder at Chainapsis, and some of the products that we either help contribute or help build are Keplr wallet as well as Osmosis. And yeah, we have a lot of team members here as well. So if you'd like, grab any of them, have a conversation. So yeah, what is a governator? And this is something that's been on the back of my mind for a very long time. But what a governator is, essentially I'm just taking two words and putting it together because I think the end result sounds kind of cool. But it's basically a governance-focused validator. And before we even kind of get into why or what governator is, we probably need to define the things that a validator does. And I've just kind of put a list here together, but typically the role of a validator, first and foremost is you run software that checks for the validity of the transactions and that the state transitions are correct. And that's just a fancy way of saying, hey, you run software and you want to make sure that this software continues to run very resiliently. And in case there are any type of transactions that are invalid, you make sure that doesn't get through. But typically, the software has checks for that, so just making sure that that runs in itself is good. And then there's a few other things that validators do in today's world, right? For example, I think we have seen a lot of validators who are active contributors to the protocols that they validate, and which is fantastic because if we're trying to build these decentralized systems, decentralizing who gets to commit code and write the code itself is an important factor in building this kind of long-term decentralized resilient systems. And I think a lot of validators have gotten into providing auxiliary/supplementary services for the blockchain. So for example, a lot of the people that are running IBC relayers are validators of that chain. Great example, one of my favorite teams, Cryptocurrencies, right? Like they sort of started as a validator and they kind of became this like IBC relaying powerhouse who, are doing a fantastic job making sure that these packets go from one chain to another. Some validators also run full nodes as a side, which is crucial when someone wants to get data from the blockchain or build front-end focused services. So yeah, that's really cool. Some people build front ends, different ways of staking, different ways of kind of showing governance code or dashboards and portfolios. And lastly, validators participate in governance. But I think there's kind of this differentiation of some of these things that the validators do and what is cryptographically enforced on-chain. So realistically, the only thing that the blockchain code itself cares about is the first thing, right? You want to make sure that the validators are running the software and the software is running well. A lot of these other things are sort of, nice to have ways to distinguish yourself from your other validators, but it is not something that the blockchain forces you or punishes you to for not doing. And I think out of all these, optional things, I think I would really like to focus on this participate in governance thing. Yeah. Right before we kind of dive into it, I think there is kind of this vague definition that the role of a validator is to vote on governance, but this isn't on-chain, right? This isn't enforced on-chain. So I think there's this kind of like weird expectation where some people believe, yes, this is the job of the validators, And some people say, hey, if it's not enforced on chain, then should it be considered an expectation for validators to do so? But the truth is, this wasn't always the case, right? I pulled this kind of like GitHub issue from, I believe, 2018, right? There was a day and a time where the Cosmos SDK actually had code where if validators did not vote on governance proposals, it would end up in a slashing. And there were actually many attacks that happened before the Cosmos Hub launch during the Gaia testnets where someone would put up a bunch of governance proposals and try to slash other people during kind of these like PvP incentivized testnets. So this got removed after launch, and the norm is, hey, you don't vote on governance proposals, and there's no punishment for it, so there's no direct incentive for you to do it. But yeah, and then I guess the other thing is kind of cool that the 4 people, I don't know, this was the first issue that came up when I looked up governance slashing on the Cosmos SDK. Found it fascinating that we have Chris Goes, Fede, Felix, and Dave, and all of them are still around within the ecosystem like 5 years later. I think that just kind of goes to show how great Cosmos is. Yeah, but that was the code in 2018, and here we are in 2023, and I think the class of validators, or who validators are, have evolved massively. Just as a few examples, you have VC / like self-delegation validators. So maybe they hold a lot of tokens, and their primary goal is not to be diluted by inflationary staking awards. The other thing are exchange validators. Exchange validators were not a common thing you'd find back in 2019, 2018. Today, it's the norm. If you have a proof of stake network, which has a sizable demand from the user base, very likely that exchanges will run a validator. The other thing are like validator as a service, custodial validators, where hey, we don't have the technical needs or expertise to run a validator on this chain, so we would work with another team that has expertise to kind of run our branded validator. And then last, is influencer validators, right? Like maybe they have a lot of social leverage and social power. They don't have the technical knowledge, but they would still like to kind of get into this val set because they're able to kind of sway people's opinions and things like that. But the truth is the code has not. The validator space has evolved massively, but the code has stayed largely the same as it was when the hub launched. And this is a Zaki tweet I really like. I always put this in. I find some way of putting this somewhere in most of my presentation, but the purpose of a blockchain is to create an automated representation of social consensus. And I think social consensus around validators and governance has changed quite significantly in the 5 years, but I feel like our code has not. Now we kind of go back to the governators. Because validators and governance isn't a good versus evil thing. Everyone just moves based on their best self-interest, right? I don't want to be diluted. I want staking awards. And if I don't get punished for not voting, that's what I'm going to do. So I think what we want is the evolution of code to meet the expectation, meet the reality, with kind of less of this ideal view of what validators should be doing in terms of governance. So one of my favorite movies, this is, I feel like, where Cosmos is, where it's like when exchange validators came in, we're like, great, now we're kind of this big name. Like Binance is willing to run a validator on the hub, on these other chains, but we're sort of left behind and realizing it's like, oh wait, we have to message these people every single time, and they're saying, hey, we're not going to vote on governance proposals. So this was kind of a snapshot of the state of governance of the hub, and the reds here are basically the validators who have not voted on most proposals, right? And I've kind of tallied up the numbers, and surprisingly, it's about 24% of voting power who are non-voters. And these are exchange validators, self-delegations, VCs, a lot of the categories that I've mentioned. And another thing that happens is, I don't know if you guys remember this happening, but, Twitter influencer runs a validator, because they want to participate in governance, right? Like this guy was like, hey, governance doesn't make sense for the average people. I know how to make it easy. So this unknown person basically started a validator primarily with governance participation as their selling point. But the challenge is that being able to participate in governance and running a good, highly resilient block production software are two completely different set of skills. And for these two to be kind of completely correlated together leads to situations where maybe a delegator who really believes that this person is the right person to represent my vote in governance ends up getting slashed even though they had good intentions of supporting this person. And I've talked to a few other validators, right? On why do you not vote on governance, or why do you not run a validator that is active in governance? And Binance, after the whole Steemit debate, has this internal policy where, hey, we will stay out of all governance proposals unless it's just a normal software upgrade. And as some of these kind of enterprise-focused validators have evolved, they're starting to realize and getting notes from their lawyers saying, hey, governance participation might be a liability where if you're changing the state of a blockchain and you chose to do so, you may be kind of getting into legal troubles when this ends up in the court, right? So they're like, all right, we're just not going to participate. Say we didn't have a part in this. And the other thing is, you have more of these people who want to be in governance, but they don't want accidentally getting their delegator slashed because they're not a technical person. So all a Governator is a new way of just framing block production and governance. Because we already have this idea of a voting power where if you stake a token, you get these virtual brownie points that you can stake to people called voting power. And right now, this is used for both block production and governance. But all we're trying to say is, hey, can these two things not be linked to each other, right? So, hey, I can designate validator A to be the person to produce blocks. But hey, I would also like, Governor B to be the person that represents my voting power when it comes to governance. And the key here is, I think, validators should also be able to be governators, right? It's what we're trying to propose is not a two completely different set of validator and governor set. Because I do think genuinely that most validators are people who have a lot of context in the software they run and are very well incentive aligned. But what we're trying to fix is the lack of evolution of code where the expectation is very different from the reality. So all we're trying to say is, hey, we want to be more explicit that this is a duty, and you don't have to do it. This is not something you have to do. But once you say, when you sign that transaction saying, hey, I would also like to become a governor while I'm also a validator, you're explicitly opting into this system. No one is basically forcing you to do it, right? So people would then ask me, right, hey, wouldn't the voting power almost be identical? But initially, I would say that's actually a good thing, because you don't want a system where the ideals that the block producers have are completely divergent from what the governators would like to have. And initially, while this could be identical, I think the hope is that this will diverge, right? As we see more very highly focused governators spin up, we will see kind of a lot more of average retail voting power move away from validators who may be kind of mediocre at both to kind of splitting it to highly resilient infrastructure company and a highly active governance leader, governor. And the other thing is, I think, there has to be on-chain incentives for this special class of governors to exist. I'm not saying this is a final number, I'm just throwing this out there, but what if we don't even increase the inflation, we just take the existing stake, whatever goes into the staking rewards pool, and we just split that 80-20, 90-10 with the majority of it going to the block producers. And because validators can also be governators, if you opt in to do both, what you get out of running a validator, and you're basically doing the same job and you'll be earning the same rewards. But what this allows you to do is there is this expectation that, hey, as exchange validators who have never voted on a single proposal and have no desire to do so, then maybe you shouldn't run this, right? And if it's a 90-10 split, 10% letting go of 10% of staking awards might be something that an exchange may be able to negotiate with. Obviously, this is the expectation, but what is also nice is then there is this kind of explicitness around the expectations of governance, that it can be a starting point of codifying a lot of the expectations around what representation, the people that represent voting power should be doing, not as a social consensus, but into the code of the blockchain itself. So just as random scenario, if an exchange validator opts out to becoming a governor, then let's say, hey, they traditionally held 2.3%, but they don't opt into governance VP, so they will just have 0. And validator A, they're like, hey, we have already been active in governance, we're fine with keeping that. So they opt in, and they would basically inherit the existing voting power as governor. What's kind of cool is now you allow this special class of governors to exist, where influencers or people who are extremely active in the forums but have never been incentivized for the work and effort they put in are able to kind of become a special class on chain, right? And I think that's the important thing. And the other cool scenario is you are able to kind of run a validator that specializes in governance and potentially have a higher voting power on governance than you do on block production, or the other way around. And what this allows then is that, you're able to revive governance slashing conditions. I think discussions around slashing over governance have basically stalled in the past 5 years. But now that we have this explicitness, it would be cool to kind of figure out discussions on, hey, how do we codify expectations, right? Turn these laws into actual code. And I think there were a lot of other ideas on how we can get to this state without writing something called a governor. And a lot of things I hear was around auth-Z, right? So some will be like, hey, can't delegators essentially do this by auth-Zing their proposal vote message to someone else, and they can basically tally up and vote on the user's behalf. But I think if we want a system that runs, right? Like, you want this to be explicit. You want the voting power to be explicit and recorded on-chain as a state. And auth-Z doesn't really allow you to do it. And front-end's just, it'll be really difficult to figure out, hey, how much voting power does this person have? Because then you have to run multiple queries to figure out all these auth-Z delegations. Alternatively, validators could also let someone else do this, but you come to the same problem of there is this lack of transparency, right? Like, what we want is maintain the same principle of Cosmos, where it is this liquid democracy of where you're able to vote on yourself, but you're also able to inherit the kind of voting power of your validator or governor in this case, should they kind of agree with what you were going to vote with anyways. The other thing is, shouldn't we just be minimizing governance? And I think the best discussions around governance minimization only happens when we have an explicit expectation around governance. And that's not the case, right? So I do think that this is sort of the first step, even if you want governance minimization to kind of get to that state eventually. And lastly, software upgrade proposals. Hopefully there would be this two-step process where you don't get this thing where the governors say, hey, we're going to make all these changes, and the expectations from the block producers are, hey, we don't want to do this. And in that case, then the chain could potentially halt. So there could be this two-step process for actual software upgrade proposals versus text proposals. Obviously, this is just an idea and a framework that's been on the back of my mind. Just getting this out there to see, if there's other like-minded people who have thought about the same thing or have ideas around this. But, this isn't perfect. There's a lot of questions on how do you balance governance activeness versus populism. Because what you don't want is just people say, hey, we're gonna, give you more money if you delegate to me. And what you end up with is just a very poor, non-robust system, pure populism. And, how big should this val set be? Because it doesn't have to be the same as the block producers. And, we already have issues around validator profitability. And, if some validators are having to let go of 10 or 20%, it might be an issue because, some of them are already not making enough to be sustainable. And yeah, lastly, this is less of a problem since you can halt the chain. But yeah, how do we ensure that there's some level of distribution in voting power for governators? Or maybe there doesn't have to be, right? Because this isn't directly linked to consensus. But yeah, just throwing this out there. Would love to get a discussion started. And hopefully get someone to build this as well. So if you're building this in Hackmos, I'd love to talk to you. I have more ideas. Yeah, thank you very much.